Carbon gives it much more strength than the iron would have by itself.
Rick Vinci, a professor of material science at Lehigh University, says that just like in cooking, the ingredients of the metal can make all the difference.
It's a little bit like being in the kitchen and adjusting a recipe by adding a pinch of salt, or maybe you say, oh boy, this could really use just a hint of lemon, and somehow that little bit really changes the food. And in the same way, some of these subtle chemistry changes can really make important adjustments to the overall properties of the metal.
By the end of the second day, the furnace has already eaten up 18 tons of iron ore sand and charcoal, the fire's fuel, and also the source of its carbon.
Steel is composed of the element iron and the element carbon. The ancient Japanese could physically see iron, but they had no idea what carbon was. They understood that charcoal was needed for the process, but they didn't understand charcoal as carbon. Carbon wasn't discovered as an element until just a few hundred years ago.
Today, the recipe is no secret. The hard part is keeping the oven cooking just right. Throughout this smelting process, Kihara must tend to the furnace to make sure that nothing goes wrong.
The furnace is like a human being. We can think of the iron and coal as food. We feed her, she digests it, so that she will bear good tamahagane.
Inside the furnace, the iron and carbon are slowly forming into the right mixture. Beneath the furnace lies a chamber nearly 10 feet deep. Ventilation channels flank either side. Any moisture seeping in from the ground would lower the temperature, ruining the steel, and they would have to start all over again. In the very hot center of the furnace, the iron and carbon combine. This process happens at the atomic level. By nature, iron atoms bond to one another in a specific geometric arrangement. When heated, that structure changes form.
Iron actually has two different forms that it takes. A low temperature form in which the atoms are arranged in a particular way, and a high temperature form in which they're arranged a little bit differently. There's actually more space between the iron atoms at high temperature.
But when this high temperature form cools quickly, it contracts, and the carbon atoms become trapped in between the iron atoms.
If it does that, the iron can't fully assume the structure that it would like to. It'll be distorted by virtue of the fact that the carbon atoms are lodged into these spaces that are really too small for them to fit into. And that kind of form of steel, iron and carbon mixed together, is very, very hard, very, very strong.
Manipulating this heating and cooling process, as well as controlling the ingredients in the steel, allows modern metallurgists, or ancient craftsmen, to change the properties of the metal.
Metals are elements, so they're made up of single kinds of atoms. Most of the elements on the periodic table, it turns out, actually are metals, even though we don't think of them as metals. We usually think of metals as being solids. They're shiny, they conduct electricity and heat really well. And perhaps more importantly for a lot of the uses, they have this ability to bend, to take on new forms, and also to have their mechanical properties be controllable. And so by adjusting their chemistry, by adding a little bit to them or taking something away, by controlling their heat treatment, you have a lot of control over their properties, and this makes them very, very versatile and really the underpinning for the modern society that we live in.
Modern like the skyscrapers on the busy streets of Japan. These towers of steel have their roots in the ancient metal craft of the sword. In the traditional smelting process, the metal ore never completely reaches a liquid state, so that the steel ore, or tamahagane, will not be uniform in its mixture of iron and carbon. Some parts will have more carbon, some less. These different mixtures of steel will become very important in the engineering of the sword. More carbon makes the steel harder so that it can hold a sharper edge. But too much carbon makes the steel brittle, and no samurai wants to be caught with a broken sword. In engineering, there is a limit to how hard you can make the metal before it becomes brittle. The standard test for measuring this is called the Sharpie test. Here, a large pendulum is used to break a sample of metal. Hard metals don't bend, so they break more easily. A metal that resists the energy or force of the pendulum and bends before it breaks is said to be tough.
In the case of the tough metal, instead of just breaking, it actually bends. And so what you'll see is a lot of stretching on one side of the metal until eventually it's been torn apart. It actually looks a fair amount like if you take a piece of taffy or a Tootsie Roll. And as you know, the Tootsie Roll or the taffy will stretch first, and then it will come apart. And you'll see the effect of that stretching. You want very large energy absorption to have a tough metal. You want it to be able to take a lot of damage before it breaks.
At Lehigh University, these basic principles of toughness and hardness are put to the test, literally. The Atlas Center is one of the largest metal testing facilities in the United States. Here, they can test huge metal structures to see how they will stand up in the real world.
Every time a building is built, all of the steel that goes into that building must be qualified before it could be used in the structure. And some of those tests include hardness and toughness measurements.
Steel beams from skyscrapers and bridges are trucked here to be put through punishing tests that simulate major earthquakes or 100 years of heavy truck traffic.
There's quite a bit of motion, though. I don't know. Getting a structure to survive with that kind of motion is, I think, very, very impressive.
Collapse prevention, that's what we're after.
Collapse prevention, right. You can see how it's deforming and bending, but not cracking.
Absolutely.
The test is recorded in time-lapse footage that shows these structures pushed to the breaking point. Engineering metals, whether in a sword or a superhighway, is about making sure they are tough enough to last.
And this whole test takes how long?
Well, this test took a whole day. It simulates about 30 seconds of earthquake.
At the back of the Atlas Center is an area they call the graveyard. Here is the final resting place of structures that weren't